On the podcast today, we are going to speak about Chapter 79 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 79th episode of the 81 Meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And as usual, Guy will read Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
After a bitter quarrel, some resentment remains. What can be done about this? The wise keep their half of the bargain, but do not exact their due. Virtuous people perform their part, but those without virtue require others to fulfill their obligations. The Tao of heaven is impartial. It remains with those who are good.
After settling a great dispute, there must be remaining resentments. How can this be considered good? Therefore the sage holds the left part of the contract, but does not demand payment from the other person. Those who have virtue hold the contract. Those without virtue hold the collections. The heavenly Tao has no favorites. It constantly gives to the kind people. So this chapter is about the Tao of giving versus those who take, and how a sage remains impartial as opposed to someone who lives with partiality. But before we get into that, there's a bit of a cultural detail in this chapter where, especially in Derek's translation, where it says the left part of the contract. So if we go back to some 5,000 years ago at the beginning of Chinese civilization, there was no paper, so it was hard to keep track of debts, who owed money, and so forth and so on. So they had a very clever system where they would use wood or tree bark, where they would write the amount on either the wood or tree bark, tear it in half, and the left side of the contract would go to the lender and the right side would go to the borrower. And so because it was perfectly torn, that was the way to authenticate whether someone has really paid their dues or not, right? So that is part of that chapter. So the sage is holding that left part of the contract, and they talk about the takers here are the ones out searching and trying to maybe collect tax from people and this and that. They're really trying to bleed a stone dry, so to speak.
Yeah, this Derek Lin's translation is very descriptive in that way, whereas this one just says like the wise keep their half of the bargain. They can mean anything really, but it is nice to hear some like a cultural background in ancient times in China, and it is a very clever way to identify the borrower and lender, right? As well, so the way the tree bark was broken, that if it perfectly matches, then you know that that person has been paid or not. And also it says those without the virtues take the collections here, or in this translation says taking the other people to fulfill their obligations, so obligation or collection. So in the original writing in Tao Te Ching of chapter 79, actually obligations or this collection literally meant like a tax system at that time that was prevalent in the Jew empire. So at the time that tax system particularly was very heavy on people. So people had to pay a tenth of their harvested agriculture had to pay as a tax. So I think Lao Tzu was made an example of that kind of tax system, how it was unfairly charged on people, and these leaders without virtues just taking this collecting the debt or tax from people as if they must pay or they really owe to the so-called government and whatnot. So that kind of cultural or historical background is quite interesting, and it is fascinating how Lao Tzu used that kind of cultural background, and also I guess that for him that was what's happening contemporarily. So he wanted to make that as an example to give people lesson to explain the Tao of giving, right? So practice the wise people's, the sages' approach here, as you mentioned. This chapter is trying to say that, yes, a virtue of giving to people.
Yeah, and the Tao of giving is not just giving money or material possessions. It's about giving a kind word, forgiveness, compassion to someone, a hug, all of these things are also giving, right? Like we don't want to reduce that to, because people might read this chapter and might reduce it to some sort of monetary value or talking about tax and so forth and so on. But as you were saying about this chapter in relation to, you know, the tax system and that back in the day, taking a tenth of the harvest and this and that, it relates a lot to the modern day. I mean, it's a lot worse than that. Let's say that. If you want to go to Australia, they might take 60% of your tax. They might tax you 60%. So leave you with nothing, bleed you completely dry. So, but, you know, that's another point about the chapter, because Lao Tzu is highlighting that people of that nature, of the taking nature, are kind of like vultures. They're like wolves preying over society, trying to just, you know, wring every last dollar out of someone. And they don't really give anything back in return. It's just they constantly take, right? And so that's a saying that if we have that impartial mind, we're giving impartially and we're not deciding what we should do to one person or the other. Like our impartiality and our love and compassion and forgiveness is across the spectrum, right? And so that's a spiritual attitude and mentality that we need to also evolve to as spiritual aspirants and Tao cultivators, is to get to that stage where we have that impartiality. And so in this chapter, Lao Tzu mentions, like, you know, it's hard for people to have a dispute and to be aloof after it and not care about it, right? Where most people, they hold the other part of the contract and they want that person to pay them back for, you know, maybe the wrongdoing that they've encountered, right? And so I often I've spoke about on the podcast before, like dog psychology, right? Like I was probably pretty much raised with dog psychology as well. I still have it to my own detriment a little bit in my age now. But the idea that, you know, someone could do something to somebody, but you don't hold it against them forever, right? And you move along pretty quickly. I often use India as an example, because you and I have lived in India for a long time, and you'll see two people argue, and the next minute, like 5 minutes later, they're sitting down having a chai. Whereas if that was in Australia, you probably wouldn't speak to that person for a year, 2 years, maybe never again. And so in cultures like that, there's a lot, they retain a lot of whatever the situation was. Whereas when you have dog psychology, just like dogs, they can get into an argument and then they're sniffing each other's butt 5 minutes later. And so, as you know, because you live with me, and, you know, it's been to my detriment having that dog psychology, because one of the problems with that is people can take you for a ride, right? Because people prey on other people's kindness. And that's also what Lao Tzu is pointing out here too. These tax collectors, so to speak, metaphorically, are preying on people's innocence and kindness, right? And so they prey on them and they take from them rather than, you know, giving to them or giving a kind word or just treating them as a human being. And that's kind of the society that we've developed in the modern day. It's evolved to that stage where we've gone very far away from the Tao of giving, right? And again, we're not just talking about monetary or material, just about giving a smile, giving a kind word, being a good person, being friendly in the environment. This is giving, rather than being a prick, being grumpy, maybe trying to take money from people and so forth and so on. So that's unfortunately the society that we've created.
Yes, so being a kind person or practicing kindness, loving kindness, and things like that can be, detrimental to your own life in the social settings, I think. Yes, people take advantage of kind people, good-hearted people. But I think holding, like in the first line, holding resentment towards somebody because of whatever the problem you might had is like, yes, you feel it's unfairly treated, right? And you feel like you are in a loss of something, and you get angry and whatnot. But the holding resentment in the end is actually, it comes back to you as a burden, I think. And it has a different effect to yourself, I think. Yes, of course, there is no excuse. You have all right to be angry and feel unjust, right? Yep. But if you're holding grudges and resentment against the specific person, then I think it always just comes back to you as a burden. And yeah, like the bitter quarrel here says it makes you bitter, right? And it may make you become a bitter person too, if that kind of compiled on one another and different kind of situations, right? So need to be able to let go of that resentment. That doesn't mean that you you have to forgive that person, or you need to like be a saint, and it doesn't mean that. It means that you just let it go as it is, just leave it in the past. You know it happened, but you don't get bothered by it anymore. And that is just what you can do best for your own well-being and for you to move forward, right? So that's something also we need to remember. And being kindness, yes, people do take advantage of kind people, but that is why actually somewhat feel really discouraging to be kind these days, right? Like, because again, you've got to be pretty aggressive these days to be rich and get that notoriety and things like that. But yes, it may work for short term, or that very moment, or that very situation that happened that may work in favor of your position, but we know that in long term it doesn't give you a good echo, let's say. I think no matter what you practicing kindness, it only reverberates in nature and the way, so that not that necessarily you are like asking something in return, but because that is the right thing to do. So that's always been Lao Tzu's lesson throughout the Tao Te Ching. So that's something as a natural human being, right? To practice that decency, I think it's actually you're taking some kind of responsibility, I think. And whether people notice or not, you are leaving that message for other people. And some people might notice it, so they might see it. Some people don't see it because they're not sensitive enough to see it. Well, that's not your problem. So, but it's important that you leave a good message, good energy around you. Just being who you are, practicing kindness for others.
That's right. And like Lao Tzu, like what you were saying, Lao Tzu's not saying that we should expect anything in return, right? Like, so if you're operating from the impartial Tao of giving, you're not really expecting anything in return. That's, again, getting into the mind of the taker, right? And so this is, as you were saying, this is what makes good people become essentially angry and negative, right? Like, so that's Lao Tzu's warning to just the ordinary, decent, innocent, good people, right? Because kind people can be taken down the garden path and become very jaded and bitter as they live their life, and then they have this ingrained anger that kind of pervades their life as they go into old age. And this is a big problem. This is like Lao Tzu's warning in this chapter, because he's like, if you give impartially, as a sage does, you're not expecting anything in return. You're even giving to the a-hole, but you're not expecting anything in return, because, well, first of all, the a-hole's not going to give you anything in return, right? That's why they're an a-hole. So, but you give impartially regardless, right? And so that's the point. So you're not collecting payment. You're not sitting around holding the left side of the contract going, where's that right side? You know, like, you owe me a payment.
I'm here waiting.
Yeah, I did this for you, so you owe me, right? And this is not, again, not dog psychology, right? This is not the impartiality. You're still searching for some sort of reward for the good that you are doing. You're not actually giving impartially. You're giving partially because you're seeking a reward for being a good person, where if you are a good person, you don't seek anything in return. And that's Lao Tzu's point. We're not seeking anything in return. We're just living our life and giving impartially, and realizing that, look, sometimes things do happen that are not good, but because you have a mindset where you don't retain a lot of anger and hatred, you can move forward, right? And so the problem with our subconscious is we might encounter one situation with some person and we retain that, and if we haven't done a lot of self-work and introspection, then a similar situation to that may arise in the future, even though it's not exactly the same, but the same subconscious response will come up to the conscious mind, and then you will treat it in that way, right? And so Lao Tzu is saying that's a fundamental flaw about, you know, our own personal psychology. So the thing is, if you give impartially, you're perfectly in alignment with the law of karma, in accord with the Tao, right? Like, you're not really seeking a reward for what you're doing, nor are you seeking any type of punishment. You're just giving because that's the energy of the Tao. You are giving. You give a smile, you give a kind word. You're not walking around all day bitter and grumpy and criticizing people and so forth and so on, because you understand that there is a type of karmic law that exists within the universe, you know, and so the Tao usually reciprocates to someone's psychology and kindness and so forth and so on, but you have to sort of get out of this partial perspective of how people are treating you as well, right? Because, for example, if you are a good person and a kind person, you're not going to just change. You know, it's just not going to happen. Just because one person treated you bad or 10 people treated you bad, it's still your nature to do that. So you're not just going to do that, right? You're not going to become the tax collector. You're going to always hold the left side of the contract. And maybe the problem is you're hoping that you're going to get something in return from somebody. And I would like to say to those type of people, if you're hoping for that, then, you know, good luck. Because sometimes people just don't change. And that's, again, a realization that people have to come across on the path. It's not like we're going to live in some spiritual utopia where everyone's treating each other really good. This is actually not even part of the spiritual traditions, this idea of a utopian society. This is a Western idea. You know, the Eastern traditions are very real. Obviously, there's always going to be a-holes. There's always going to be someone who's going to try and take from people. This is always just going to be the way it is. How can you navigate, though, with that dynamic existing in the world? That's Lao Tzu's perspective. If you have an impartial view, then you can easily navigate any circumstance that you encounter.
Yes. It's not about changing the world, is it? Like, it's all about changing ourselves. And that's always what's been the Eastern philosophy in general. And that's also our task as well. Like something to change externally, it takes a lot of time and effort, and that sometimes leading to this activist movement too, right?
Yeah,
and
that's
right. You need to go and change other people's lives, and, you know, in the name of self-righteous and this and that, but often that driven by a certain type of ideology, and we know that. Truthful change has to happen always from within each individual, and that's the only way that can happen, the real change.
That's right. And one of Lao Tzu's point in relation to that is that, like, if you are in the art of the Tao of giving, you're not thinking about yourself a lot, because you're giving with an open heart. And I think that part of the problem in the world is this self-obsession that we have. We're always thinking about ourselves, so then we become a tax collector. And we don't pay our debts, so to speak, because we give two hoots about what other people think, right? And you and I have both seen this, particularly in the spiritual community. You know, me teaching Eastern philosophy for around 2 decades now, we've seen many needy people who particularly, like, will prey maybe on us to get something from us, and then, you know, treat us a certain way, right? And so that's obviously a microcosm. We see that a lot. We see a lot of people like that, but they're more obsessed with themselves as opposed to following just the natural, impartial way of just, maybe if I just be a kind person, like something very basic and generic, that'll open up more of a spiritual dimension for myself, as opposed to being so self-obsessed about myself and then not caring what other people think and so forth and so on, right? And so, you know, that's kind of like what the eros is, right? Like, that the word, the eros, is about giving your life away to others, in a sense, rather than like being so self-obsessed with yourself. There's actually sort of a real deep spiritual connection with life when you do that. People often feel this when they have children, right? But you can have this just in ordinary life too. As a sage, you can have this, right? Like, Lao Tzu was impartial to all and didn't need to, he wasn't a needy person. He didn't need anything from anyone. He just didn't care, right? So he didn't prey on society, as a lot of people unfortunately do in the modern day.
Yes. Yes, self-obsession is something like a disease, isn't it? Like that people can't get out of. They just are stuck in their own mind, and they just can't get out of it. And often, somehow, in spiritual practice, somewhat people take in a interesting way, so that make them lock into that world even more, right? And that becomes a huge problem. But walking on the spiritual path is all about transcending the self, really. Like in the book, The Man's Search of Meaning by Viktor Frankl, said that the bottom line of finding like a purpose of meaning of your life is beginning from the very desire and will to go beyond yourself. Like, so that is the bottom line. That has to be practiced the very first, and has to be done the first to go even further from there. Because once you stop thinking about yourself, stop obsessing about yourself, that's where you will be able to see the world truly as it is. And also you will kind of see what the world kind of demands from you, not what you want from the world, right? Like you're not trying to take things from the world, like in relation to this chapter. You think differently, like you're trying to think that what the world is demanding from you, so that kind of you're taking on a challenge almost. So to respond to that as correctly as possible is to stop thinking about yourself, really. And that's I think, the first step we need to all take.
Yeah, give yourself to something. I always like what you always say to me in private, like when we see people who are, especially on a spiritual path, who are self-obsessed, like we might go to Tiruvannamalai, for example, in South India, and people get like so self-obsessed, and you can tell like there's something not right with their aura or something, like they're so always thinking about themselves that they've kind of disconnected with reality, and they're not happy people. And you simply say they need karma yoga. Because it is a fact, right? Like, because karma yoga can help you give your life to something else, which takes the focus off you. So you're focusing just on something else, and that has a really big effect, right? Like, so that's kind of the Tao of giving mentality, is that you, in that sense, you're giving your life to whatever vocation you are doing, and by following karma yoga, right? And you know, if I told everyone listening and watching the amount of idiotic jobs I've done throughout my life, you'd just fall off your chair. But they were necessary to be where I am right now, because the reason why, especially you and I would say, are very real about especially spirituality and philosophy is because we've done a lot of that karma yoga, where a lot of people, maybe they were brought up rich or something, or they read a lot of New Age books, and their ideas of spirituality are very floaty, and then they sort of get away from the ordinary. But it's within the ordinary that you become extraordinary, and that's just a fact. And so I think a lot of people disconnect from that understanding. They start to distance themselves from ordinary life because they don't see the beauty in it anymore. And that's when you need karma yoga, because there's a real beauty in ordinary life. And that's, like I said, that's how just ordinary people like you and I and everyone listening and watching can truly become extraordinary. So guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.